And welcome everyone to the webinar. I hope that you enjoy it. And if you have any questions, I might get to them now, or you're welcome to email me as well. I'm sure that they will provide you with my email information as well, so you're welcome to do that. So welcome. We are going to be discussing trumping NAFTA. So just to give you a little brief introduction into our discussions today, we're going to be talking about President Trump and his developing strategies when it comes to NAFTA. Of course, with his presidential campaign, he honed in on the fact that he wanted to withdraw from the NAFTA free trade agreement, and then that has evolved over time to where he has now begun to discuss renegotiating the deal. So a lot of people, especially in the law school arena, were really curious as to what kind of power President Trump would have to withdraw from NAFTA unilaterally, or would he have to go through a more formal process with other branches of government to do so, if that's something that he wants to do. So that's what we're going to be discussing here. We're going to briefly talk about some winners and losers in NAFTA, how it was enacted, how we can get out of it or withdraw from it, according to what President Trump has mentioned both in his campaign and in the earlier stages of his of his presidency. So that's what we will be covering today, and I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to get off the screen now so that you can see the PowerPoint slides a little better. All right, so trumping NAFTA. So I was going to begin our discussions talking about just generally about free trade agreements and how they are enacted and ratified here in the U.S. so that we can get an idea of where we're headed toward the end of the speech here. So I'm going to compare NAFTA to the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was a free trade agreement that President Barack Obama had negotiated, and he had signed that prior to exiting his presidency. And that was a big deal at the time. The TPP represented many countries across the world, and it constituted nearly 40% of the global economy. And because of that, it was just a really big deal to either show an interest by signing it with an executive power, and also to withdraw from it, which is what President Trump did within, I think, around 3 days of his presidency. It was obviously one of the top priorities on his list to withdraw from. So, and that's exactly what he did. Within about 3 days, he signed an executive action to withdraw from TPP. And the thing is here with TPP is that it had not been adopted or ratified by Congress here in the U.S. So it technically had not become domestic law. And for that reason, when President Trump signed his executive action to withdraw from TPP, there wasn't a lot of political backlash because he was not undoing something that Congress or the legislative branch had done. So essentially, when we're talking about President Trump and when he was a candidate and when he wanted to withdraw from a lot of free trade agreements, he was indeed able to do that with TPP because it had not yet been enacted by Congress. But when it comes to NAFTA, it's a little different because, as we all know, NAFTA has been in place for many years, I think 23 years or so. It started in 1994. So it's been around for a while. It was ratified by Congress many years ago. So it's going to be somewhat of a different circumstance or a different procedure that President Trump would have to take in order to withdraw from NAFTA. It's not going to be as simple as something like TPP that had not been domestically ratified. So before I get into NAFTA specifically, I wanted to talk a little bit about free trade agreements generally when it comes to U.S. law and how they are enacted and ratified here in the U.S. So to start, we're just talking about the idea of a free trade agreement itself, which could be compared to other international laws such as treaties. So in the U.S., when we have an international treaty, those are called self-executing. Basically, those become law here in the U.S. upon a two-thirds vote in the Senate and ratification by the president. Free trade agreements are not treated that way. Rather, they are called congressional executive agreements, which by name means that you have to have some cooperation between the legislative and executive branches of the federal government. So what happens is you will have the president, which has constitutional powers under Article 2, which enable him or her to conduct foreign relations on behalf of the United States. And this Article 2 power is specifically with the executive branch. It is not given to Congress. And you can imagine why. We have, several different political parties in Congress. There are a lot of different viewpoints there. So it would actually be a complete nightmare if you had Congress members going around and making foreign policy on behalf of the U.S. Rather, the reason that the Constitution was drafted the way that it was is to ensure that you have one voice on behalf of the country when it comes to foreign relations. So that is the Article 2 power, where the president has the ability to go around and negotiate free trade agreements among other foreign policy issues. And so you have the president that would be negotiating the terms and the specific provisions of the free trade agreements itself. Then you will have Congress, which is the other side of your congressional executive agreement. And Congress has powers under Article 1 of the Constitution. It starts in the Commerce Clause, which is Article 1, Section 8, where Congress retains the ultimate constitutional power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. This is crucial when it comes to enacting a free trade agreement because, of course, regulating commerce with foreign nations is, this is quintessentially what that means, is adopting free trade agreements as domestic law. And also we have the Presentment Clause, which is Section 7 of Article 1 of the Constitution. Essentially what this means is it places limitations in the checks and balances with our Constitution, where if a free trade agreement has been duly enacted by Congress, then it takes more than just the stroke of a pen of the executive branch to get rid of it, essentially allowing the president to withdraw from a free trade agreement such as NAFTA just unilaterally by an executive action like he did with TPP would be prevented by the presentment clause in the Constitution. Rather, you need that cooperation with the congressional and executive branches, or legislative and executive branches there. So now that we've spoken a little bit about generally how a free trade agreement will be enacted and adopted as domestic law here in the U.S., let's start talking about NAFTA really quickly. And I'm going to start out with the very basics, and then we will get into the specifics in just a minute. So NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. The members, of course, are the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And it essentially created a trilateral trade bloc in the North America region, where there was a 15-year gradual reduction of tariff and non-tariff trade barriers among the three nations. And it became effective in January 1st of 1994. And because NAFTA is the center stone of our topic here today, I thought it would be important to mention the fact that there are two side agreements to NAFTA. One is with regard to environmental cooperation, and the other is with regard to labor cooperation. We're really not going to get into those with the topic of today's lecture, but I did want to make sure that you were aware of their existence since we are talking about NAFTA in such great detail. So as we went into the negotiations for NAFTA, it's important to take into consideration that we already had a free trade agreement with Canada. This occurred in 88, which is very important to consider. So when NAFTA was being negotiated, it was really an opportunity for both Canada and the U.S. to form better economic relations with Mexico. That was really the big change with NAFTA. Trade with Canada has been pretty consistent going into NAFTA, and then since it's been implemented, because we already had good trade relations with them through the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. So that was 1988, and at the time in the political climate, it was politically favorable to join into free trade agreements. It was something that was viewed as a positive for any member nation going into them. So in 1990, we had President George Bush, the first one, and he had negotiated with Mexican President Carlos Salinas to discuss, among other things, a potential to have a North American Free Trade Agreement. And because of the political climate at the time, Congress granted what's called fast track authority to the president to allow him to negotiate the provisions of NAFTA in order to promote its implementation, if at all possible. Now, fast track authority, for those of you who are not familiar with it, basically Congress has those powers, constitutional powers, with regard to commerce with foreign nations that I just mentioned earlier. So when Congress gives fast track authority, that means that it is telling the executive branch, hey, listen, you can go to this foreign nation and feel free to negotiate whatever you can on our behalf. And as opposed to going through both houses of Congress and to make sure that we have a traditional vote that can be filibustered, and we might propose amendments and everything like that, fast track authority essentially means that Congress will agree to either accept or reject the deal that the president negotiates. So you would get, there will be no filibustering, there will be no amendments proposed. Rather, it's a fast track where they're going to vote, and it's either going to be yes or no, so that you can get things done on an efficient basis. So that is the political climate leading into the negotiations and ratification of NAFTA. And so it was signed by President George Bush on December 17th, 1992. And at the time, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Mexican President Salinas were also signatories to the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement. But you have to keep in mind, like we just briefly discussed, and we'll get further into it as we go along, it takes more than just a presidential signing of a free trade agreement in order for it to become effective in each member country. Rather, each member country will have its own requirements as to how it's going to domestically adopt the provisions, or whether it will or won't in the first place. And only after whatever the country's requirements are, will the free trade agreement actually become effective in that country. So here we have the Congressional Executive Agreement that we briefly discussed previously, where Congress will have to adopt the provisions of the free trade agreement through domestic legislation. So here on December 17th, 1992, you will notice that this is not January 1st, 1994, when NAFTA became effective in the U.S. Rather, it became effective later after it had passed through Congress. So it was signed by President George Bush here. And then around the same time, we had a very heated presidential election in 1992 among George Bush, Bill Clinton, and Ross Perot. So here it was really interesting in this presidential election because you had George Bush, who had negotiated NAFTA with primarily with obviously Mexico and Canada, but then you had his opposition with the other major political party in the Democratic Party with Bill Clinton, and he also supported NAFTA. So you had the two major parties of our political system who were supporting NAFTA. It, like I said, was pretty favorable politically at the time. But then we had a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who was vehemently against the adoption of NAFTA. He was fearful that it would kill millions of U.S. jobs, and he is famous for saying that there was going to be a huge sucking sound south of jobs that would go from the U.S. to Mexico. There are people on both sides of the fence when it comes to his position. Of course, there were millions of jobs that did go south to Mexico. So if you ask them, then I'm sure that they would agree with Mr. Perot. But there are others that would disagree in saying that other things have happened since NAFTA was enacted that don't necessarily go along with what Mr. Perot's position was. But during this presidential election, there were other really loud voices out there. One was Ralph Nader, who formed the Public Citizen movement, and he was pro-labor and pro-labor unions, and so he was threatening that if the Democrats were to pass NAFTA, that he would start restricting their funding. And then you had environmental activists such as the Sierra Club out there who also had concerns about the environment with the enacting of NAFTA. So especially because the presidential election was happening at the same time, you had these kinds of voices that were able to have a loud sounding box. And for that reason, we had the side agreements there with labor cooperation and environmental cooperation. So as we see here, we have George Bush, who lost this presidential election to Bill Clinton. George Bush is the one who originally signed NAFTA. Bill Clinton was the one who ratified it after congressional passing. So now let's talk about the ratification of NAFTA. This was by virtue of the NAFTA Implementation Act, which was passed by both houses of Congress. And as you can see here, it was passed by the House of Representatives in November of '93, and then it was passed by the Senate in December of '93. And as you take a look at my little numbers here, you can see that the Republicans were more in favor of NAFTA than the Democrats, but it is pretty clear here that you can see pretty good bipartisan support for its passage. So since NAFTA was enacted by Congress and then ratified by President Bill Clinton, you have your top 5 trading partners. Now this is this year, so we're bringing us up to date since we have enacted NAFTA about 23 years ago or so. And it's of no surprise that Canada and Mexico are of the top 3 trading partners that we have. It's also no surprise that China would be also within the top 3. Now, granted, these statistics are only through March of this year, so it's only the first quarter. I would anticipate China to exceed Canada over time, but as you can see, the margins are really tight here. In addition to NAFTA, there are other reasons that people would claim to contribute to the fact that Canada and Mexico are of our top trading partners. Just the geographical proximity would help there, but also we have relatively good trading relations with these 2 countries regardless. So it is of no surprise that the NAFTA free trade agreement has helped with getting these 2 countries in our top 3 trading partners, but there are other factors to consider as well. So, of course, you can imagine that after the enactment of NAFTA in each of the 3 member countries, trade has increased. So, within the first 22 years of its existence, the trade increased over 3-fold. So, it went from $290 billion in 1993 to $1.1 trillion last year. So, that is a very substantial increase, and some of that, of course, does have to do with NAFTA. Some interesting things to note, and I can't really cover every industry, but some interesting things to note with regard to these numbers is the fact that FDI, foreign direct investment in Mexico, has substantially increased. That's not just with regard to the U.S. FDI, but really globally speaking. So you have $15 billion in U.S. FDI going to Mexico when we started the NAFTA free trade agreement, but that has increased almost 8-fold since then to $107.8 billion in 2014. The reason for this is primarily with regard to companies that want to take advantage of the cheaper labor in Mexico. A lot of us have heard of the maquiladoras and other economic, you could say, opportunities. Some would say that they're not. In Mexico to take advantage of their cheaper labor. So you will have this foreign direct investment both from the U.S. and other countries where people are setting up manufacturing facilities or other types of tactile facilities for manufacturing processes there in Mexico. But there are also studies that are in support of NAFTA that says around 6 million jobs in the U.S. have formed that are dependent upon the NAFTA free trade agreement and the increase of trade among NAFTA countries. So just because you see a lot of jobs going to Mexico, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have not gained any here in the U.S., according to some people. And another interesting thing that I thought that you guys would be interested in is the cross-border trading here. And there's some statistics that have been put out there where nearly a quarter of every dollar of goods that are imported from Canada has some basis of here in the U.S. So you might have a U.S.-made component that is shipped off to Canada. It might be further processed. It might be incorporated into an overall product or an overall component and then re-imported back into the U.S. So you have that for Canada, but it is substantially higher at 40 cents on the dollar with regard to imports from Mexico. So let's talk a little bit about our trade with Mexico today, and then we will compare that also with Canada as a result of the NAFTA era. So we'll see in 1993, just before NAFTA became implemented in the U.S., we were just under, 50 billion in trade in 1993. 1994, there were some economic recessions there, which meant that there wasn't a huge increase. But by the time that we hit the year 2000, you can see that the trade levels nearly doubled. And then by the time that we hit 2015, we are nearly tripling that level of trade there to 300 billion. So that's huge. That's just in 1 year. And then just in the first quarter of this year, we have already surpassed what we did in the full years of 1993 and 1994. So we can see that we're definitely on track to exceed the 2015 numbers, and that the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement has assisted in this cross-border trade among the North American trade bloc. So just to give you an idea of who the winners are as of today with the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, I have some figures from last year in 2016 from the U.S. Census Bureau, so that's where I got this information. As you can see, I have divided things from agricultural and non-agricultural products just to give you a well-rounded idea of where we are with trading with Mexico as of today. And when it comes to agricultural products, where we are shipping products to Mexico, you can see that the vast majority there, nearly 40%, is corn. The U.S. is well known for subsidizing its corn production, and that has a lot to do with the ability of the U.S. corn producers to have a comparative advantage over those in Mexico. So for that reason, we have been exporting significant amounts of corn, mainly due to our subsidies here in the U.S. to Mexico. But to round off the rest of the agricultural products that we are sending to Mexico, soybeans, pork and pork products, and dairy products. And then when it comes to non-agricultural products that we are sending to Mexico, it is mainly machinery. We have, almost 70% with machinery or electrical machinery. We also have substantial amounts of vehicles, mineral fuels, and plastics. Now, keep in mind, these are not the only products, of course, that we are exporting from the U.S. to Mexico. I just picked the top 5 so that you can see really who the winners are. Of course, there is a very long list of hundreds or if not thousands of products out there that are engaged in the cross-border transactions, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the top 5 there. So those were the products from the U.S. to Mexico. So what are we importing from Mexico? So that's what we have in this slide. As you can see, with regard to agricultural products, it's mainly fresh vegetables and other fresh fruit. But we also have wine, beer, and snack foods that are coming from Mexico to the U.S. Those round out the top 5. And when it comes to non-agricultural products, we have vehicles, again, the electrical machinery, optical and medical instruments, and furniture and bedding. This is really interesting, as you can imagine, with the vehicles. That has been a top priority in the Trump administration to get our vehicle manufacturing back in the U.S. so that those types of jobs can be repatriated back. But as you can see here, the vehicles constitute a very large portion. Also, the electrical machinery and machinery are often attributable to the vehicle industry. So that shows you how big it is, or how big it has been before President Trump either withdraws or renegotiates NAFTA, as he has talked about doing. And then a little tidbit about the furniture and bedding, and we've talked about that, I believe, in the advanced customs regulation class that is going on this summer. We will talk a little bit about furniture and bedding and obtaining NAFTA treatment. And so just to give you a little teaser there, basically what will happen is you will have bedding manufacturers that are often in Asian countries. They will make sheets or fitted sheets and perhaps an unfilled comforter over in an Asian country, and then they will have Mexican labor in Mexico fill the comforter with certain down comforter, down filling, or cotton, or whatever it is, and do whatever else it is that is a minimum requirement to make it to be a good of a NAFTA country, to be made in Mexico. And then after that, they will import the whole bedding ensemble into the U.S. under the preferential treatment of NAFTA after they have done the minimum requirements to make sure that it is transitioned into a good of Mexico. So a lot of companies are doing that these days, where they are importing products into Mexico and they are ensuring that they are meeting the minimum requirements of Mexican labor or a Mexican transition of the product to qualify for this NAFTA treatment. And so with furniture and bedding, you can see that more because it did make in the top 5 here with the imports that we are having from Mexico. Now let's talk a little bit about Canada. So as you can see here, the trade levels are a little bit higher than that of Mexico. This also goes into the trade statistics that I just showed you before about the fact that Canada, as of right now, in our first quarter this year, was our top trading partner. Our trade levels with Canada are higher than Mexico. Mexico gets a lot of the attention because of its labor that's being used. So as we can see here, trade with Canada was about twice the amount that it was with Mexico going into the NAFTA free trade agreement. But as you can see there, by the year 2000, it still had nearly doubled. And then by the year 2015, we're up near the 300 billion marker there. Canada is a huge trading partner with the U.S. It's just one of those silent ones out there that you don't hear about a lot because it's not as controversial as something like a maquiladora story from Mexico. As far as this year, through the first quarter, you can already see that we are approaching the levels that we have for a full year going into NAFTA. So as you can see here, we're still on track to exceed our 2015 levels that I have here, and that trading among the 3 countries in the North American trade bloc are indeed expanding. So let's talk about the winners of the NAFTA free trade agreement when it comes to U.S. trade with Canada. And of course, these again are the top 5 from last year. And when it comes to agricultural products, where we are sending products to Canada, so it's U.S. exports to Canada, you will see that it mainly comprised of prepared food, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, and snack foods. You will see that that is very similar to those that we just discussed about Mexico. And then for the non-agricultural products last year, of course, it's no surprise, especially with the vehicle manufacturers in the Michigan area. Vehicles are the top export from the U.S. to Canada. Machinery, electrical machinery, again, this has a lot to do with the vehicle manufacturing process. Mineral fuels and plastics round out the top 5. And then when it comes to imports from Canada to the U.S., so what are we getting from Canada? What are the top 5 things? Snack foods, red meats, that's not something that was with Mexico, other vegetable oils, live animals, and processed fruits and vegetables. So you can see some similarities there, but there are also some differences, especially with regard to meats. With the non-agricultural products that we are getting from Canada, again, vehicles comprise a huge portion. Mineral fuels are big, especially with natural gas. Machinery, special other returns, so those are American goods that are exported to Canada and then they're re-imported back, and plastics. So you can see a lot of similarities there. It's because a lot of the same companies are taking advantage of the NAFTA free trade agreement. So you'll have GM and Ford, which were notorious, as Mr. Trump pointed out in his presidential campaign. They were notorious for having shipped their jobs down to Mexico or possibly across the Canadian border as well. So vehicles are a huge part of NAFTA. I'd say that they're one of the primary winners as a result of that. And I mean, why would that be? Well, really what happens is you can have a vehicle part potentially made in the U.S., and then you would send it to somewhere with cheaper labor such as Mexico and have the vehicle assembled together there and then just re-imported back. And by the time that you take advantage of the economical differences in production in Mexico and the U.S., it really resulted in a cheaper car for the consumer here in the U.S. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about the trade and where we are right now with our top 3 trading partners, Mexico and Canada, let's talk about the trade deficit. And there's a lot of controversy about this term, mainly because the word deficit has a very negative connotation. And in my mind, it's a lot like the unemployment numbers out there, where you'll tune into the news and say, oh, the unemployment number is X percentage. And then the first thing that they'll do is start attacking the number on the basis that, oh, well, it's great, so it sounds good, or, well, it's not great, but we're not considering other factors and things like that. Whenever you calculate a deficit, it's the same as like an unemployment number, where it really depends on the calculations and considerations that you are including and not including when you are considering, quote, the deficit. So in 2015, as we saw in our little graphs earlier, we had a trade deficit of nearly $61 billion with our NAFTA trading partners. That's huge. It's really bad, or at least it looks really bad. But this number was really calculated just by a comparison of the level of imports as credits and the level of exports as debits. But if you really think about it, it's not really accurate if that's all that you're considering, because when you think about the U.S. economy, especially in the last, I would say, 30 years, there's been a huge transition from a manufacturing economy into more of a service economy. So when you're considering a trade deficit, it's very important to take into account the fact that a lot of our U.S. workers are providing a service, so it's not necessarily a tangible cross-border transaction. So if you take into account the payments that are made from foreign nations that come into the U.S., including those from Canada and Mexico, that are for services that were not a tangible cross-border transaction, then the deficit might not be quite as bad there. So that's something to take into consideration. I really don't have a stance in this lecture when it comes to being pro-NAFTA or anti-NAFTA. Rather, I'm just pointing out the fact that sometimes when you see numbers, they might be a little misleading. So that's something to take into consideration there, especially when we were talking about the vehicles and importing vehicles from both Canada and Mexico. Again, a lot of those cars have U.S. components. They have U.S. job counterparts that are dependent upon that. So that's something to consider. So when we enact a free trade agreement, there is a theory there, and the theory is that you are taking advantage of a comparative advantage among the member countries. So of course you would export the goods where you have a comparative advantage and import the goods where you don't. And in theory, when you do that, you will have a better climate for your average consumer, because when you are manufacturing things where you have a comparative advantage, then innately that means that you are able to produce them at a lower cost, and that lower cost will be transferred over onto the consumer. Also, you would have an increase in consumer choices, because when you're taking advantage of the comparative advantage, then you would have more producers or more participants in the market. So the winners, of course, would be the ones with a competitive advantage, and the losers are those who lack a competitive advantage. But even taking into account this theory here, you have to consider other things such as government subsidies, which is why U.S. corn is the major export to Mexico. So the NAFTA winners generally, as of today in the United States, are technology services, data processing, and the medical industry. Notice that a lot of that is services, but they're taking advantage of cheaper products from cross-border transactions through NAFTA. In Canada, the minerals, forest products, energy, especially with regard to natural gas, and vehicles are the major winners there. And in Mexico, of course, the first one is labor. They have benefited from a lot of FDI from the U.S., Canada, and other nations that have employed their population in order to have tangible manufacturing facilities there. Petroleum, Mexico is known to have a governmentally owned petroleum industry there. Agricultural products, still Mexico is benefiting greatly from agricultural products. There were a lot of studies back when I was in college a long time ago where they were talking about the influx of the agrarian society, where you would have rural farmers in Mexico that have lost their job as a result of NAFTA. And really what happened is there was this huge population change from the campo, the I can't think of the English word, the boonies, into more of the major Mexican cities, or to immigrate to other countries such as the U.S. as well. That is part of what happened, where the subsistence farmers were displaced. But when it comes to the larger farmers in Mexico, they were definitely a winner and still are in Mexico. And then you have vehicles and parts as well. I know that GM and Ford had plants out there, but they're not the only ones who are taking advantage of NAFTA and the preferential trading treatment there. You have a Nissan plant that I visited one time when I was working for a court in Mexico. They were huge there in the Cuernavaca region, which was a little south of Mexico City. Nissan, Toyota has a plant there. A lot of other non-U.S. Vehicle companies have plants there as well. So as long as they are using the requisite level of labor or products in Mexico, then they're able to take advantage of the preferential treatment of NAFTA. So, as we talked about, what kind of jobs has the U.S. lost as a result of the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement? It's really with regard to manufacturing, specifically with electronics, apparel goods, and the automotive industry. So really, the one that has been hardest hit are the low-skilled American workers who are primarily in these industries, but it has created, in theory, an increased demand for college-educated workers here in the U.S. I'm sure that there are a lot of college-educated folks out there that would disagree with that, but in theory, that is what the testing indicates. So let's get back to Mr. Trump now that we've taken a good look at the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement and where we are. I wanted to give, an unbiased view of what's going on with NAFTA, because when you have President Trump, who was campaigning on the protection of U.S. jobs and a populist movement, it is important to consider that, yes, he is correct in a lot of different ways. The U.S. has lost a lot of jobs as a result of NAFTA, but at the same time, there are a lot of jobs that are dependent upon NAFTA, not to mention the fact that we are getting a lot of lower prices for a lot of the products and foods that we are eating as a result of NAFTA as well. So there are pros and cons to each. Really not taking a stance, like I said, but I just wanted to make sure that I pointed out both sides, because with whatever President Trump does, with keeping it the way it is, changing it, or withdrawing altogether, there will be winners and losers to that as well. So we're talking about Trump's proposed unilateral changes in his campaign and how they have changed recently for a renegotiation. So can President Trump unilaterally withdraw from NAFTA? Well, of course, like I've indicated at the very beginning, the answer is no. The U.S. Constitution does not specifically provide any branch of government to unilaterally withdraw from a free trade agreement. It really doesn't address congressional executive agreements directly anyway. So it's important to take a look at statutes and other areas that would improve upon our knowledge of the constitutional authorities that the legislative and executive branches have. And with respect to that, with our domestic law and who can do what with regard to free trade agreements, you can find a lot about that in the Trade Act of 1974, specifically with regard to Section 125. And there's a lot of discourse about it because it's no secret that President Trump has really ruffled some feathers, and he's trying to get into areas of law that have not been used potentially ever or rarely used. Or if they have been used, they were used in a political climate that enabled them to do so without a lot of ruckus. So When it comes to this section in the Trade Act of 1974, some people believe that this would give statutory authority to the president to withdraw from a U.S. trade agreement without getting congressional approval. But I would say that the majority of people disagree with that in their interpretation of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, essentially because Congress has the ultimate authority to conduct commerce with foreign nations, then for a presidential or an executive withdrawal to undo what they have enacted domestically would be an unbalance of powers there. So that's generally the consensus there as far as the majority of opinions. However, there are some out there that would believe that the Trade Act of 1974 would enable Mr. Trump to unilaterally withdraw. When it comes to NAFTA specifically, Article 2205 is what provides for the withdrawal provisions. So that is what will tell us how any member can withdraw from the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement. And in a nutshell, because I'm starting to run out of time here, sorry you guys, I'm getting a little long-winded apparently. With regard to 2205, essentially it says that a member nation can give 6 months prior written notice to the other parties, and they will be able to withdraw after that 6-month period is up. But there are some nuances to that we would need to take into place. So one thing to consider is the fact that, yes, President Trump can give a written notice to the other NAFTA members, of course, Mexico and Canada, hey, we're intending to withdraw, so 6 months from now is whatever date, and you can consider us as not a member anymore at that point. In order for that to take a full effect in the U.S. as far as the domestic laws that have been enacted by Congress, the NAFTA Implementation Act, Congress would actually have to agree with that and undo what they have done congressionally with the NAFTA Implementation Act. But technically speaking, we can quote withdraw upon a 6-month prior written notice. But there's some NAFTA provisions that would cease immediately upon a withdrawal, and those are in sections 101 to 106. One of the most important ones of those are the dispute resolution provisions with regard to the anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So essentially right now, while we have NAFTA, if we have a dispute about anti-dumping and countervailing duties, then if the recipient party disagrees with the imposition of the duty, then they can call a panel, a NAFTA panel, and see whether or not they are legal or not. So we have our domestic law there, the Trade Act of 1974. And essentially, even if President Trump wanted to withdraw and he gave his little written notice, it does require the 6 months prior notice, but also under the Trade Act of 1974, it provides that unless there are very special circumstances involved, when the U.S. withdraws from a free trade agreement, the status quo of what was under the free trade agreement with regard to the preferential treatment would stay there for another year. Essentially, that is there in the Trade Act of 1974 in order to promote economic stability, where you're not going to have some change overnight. Rather, the people who are affected in the industries that will be, negatively affected can make provisions for themselves in order to prepare for the changes. So even if President Trump went through on his campaign promise and, quote, withdrew from NAFTA by an executive action, number one, the first thing to consider is that he has to give a 6-month prior notice anyway before the withdrawal actually took place. It would not take place overnight. Number two is nothing would change absent dire circumstances over an 18-month period. So even if he were to do what he said, it would not be immediate. That's the first thing that we need to take into consideration. Second, we need to make sure that this is actually the provisions in the Trade Act of 1974 that govern what I just said about keeping the status quo for 1 year. So I wanted to give you the statutes there just in case you wanted to look it up yourself. Under certain circumstances, if they are dire, upon the withdrawal of NAFTA, President Trump could notify Congress that he is imposing new tariffs upon Mexico and or Canada, and hold a public hearing about that. And he could do it that way, but it would be very unpopular politically with the unrest about it altogether already. So it's unlikely that he would do something like that. There are other post-withdrawal limitations. So when President Trump was going around in his campaign talking about how he's going to withdraw from NAFTA and impose a 20% tariff on vehicles and all of these things, that's not necessarily something that he can do. There are certain international law provisions, specifically with regard to the WTO, which was formerly GATT, the World Trade Organization, that would limit President Trump's ability or even Congress's ability to raise tariffs on any particular good or any particular country. So here is something to consider. We have MFN, which is most favored nation. This is the treatment that the U.S. has agreed to give to other countries as a result of being a WTO, World Trade Organization member. So the average applied MFN rate for the U.S. is 3.51 as opposed to 7.52 for Mexico. And then we have a simple average bound tariff, 3.47 in the U.S. and Mexico at a whopping 36.12. So what does this mean? Well, this is what this means. Say that the U.S. withdraws from NAFTA and they want to raise tariffs against Mexico because President Trump is mad at Mexico for whatever reason about the wall. Okay, if that were to happen, then upon the withdrawal, potentially speaking, in order to be compliant with the WTO standards, U.S. imports of Mexican goods could be raised by 3.7% up to 3.51%. And then the Mexican imports for U.S., this is what the Mexicans would have to pay on a tariff to import our goods, would immediately be raised by 7.52%, but they could go all the way up to 36.12%. That's huge. That's a big difference between the treatment that we will be able to give to them and that they will be able to give to us. So there are substantial retaliations that can be made without international law repercussions there. Mexico definitely has the upper hand here, so we need to take that into consideration before withdrawing or while we are renegotiating things with NAFTA. This is something that we need to consider. If Mexico raises their tariffs on U.S. goods, and we are relying upon our exports to Mexico, and a lot of jobs are, then this would substantially negatively affect the U.S. And this is why, it's likely why, President Trump has changed his tune over time from an absolute withdrawal, oh my gosh, we're going to protect U.S. jobs, to hey, why won't we renegotiate this so that I can do my campaign promises of protecting my people and my jobs, while at the same time, still trading with you and having good and benevolent economic relations. So are we going to withdraw from NAFTA? Maybe, maybe not. But these are some of the reasons as to why we would or would not do so. I found it very interesting as far as President Trump's approach to NAFTA, and I am glad that he is willing to consider a renegotiation of it. If a withdrawal would be appropriate for the U.S., I'm not opposed to that either. I do think that it is important to negotiate free trade agreements in a way that is beneficial for your own country. But the thing is before we enter into any free trade agreements or before we negotiate with any new countries with regard to any free trade agreement, it's important to take into consideration exactly how they're going to affect the major industries in each country and to pre-negotiate how things are going to be handled while the free trade agreement is there. I think the idea of a free trade agreement is fabulous, where you're taking advantage of the comparative advantage of several nations to get together about that. But it's just important to take into effect the unintended consequences as well for negotiating or renegotiating a free trade agreement. So with that, I hope that you enjoyed it. our little talk about NAFTA and a potential withdrawal. And so that's me. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to email me. We will provide you with my contact information. And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much, Professor Cauley. That was an absolutely outstanding presentation. There is one question that came in through the chat, if you'd be willing to answer this. How would a most favored nation agreement have been different from NAFTA for Canada and Mexico?
Well, okay, so when you're looking at the tariff schedule at MFN, you will have one column, which is column 1, and then column 2. So column 1 is MFN treatment, and generally speaking, most countries in the world have MFN treatment. The only ones in column 2 which don't have MFN treatment is North Korea and Cuba. So when it comes to MFN treatment, that has not much to do with a free trade agreement itself. Really, that is the tariff that you would apply to any country, generally speaking, so long as it's not North Korea or Cuba. So they don't really have a connection within a free trade agreement. The purpose of a free trade agreement is to get your tariffs even lower than that MFN treatment. The MFN treatment is kind of a global standard for all of your quote friends. So what would happen when I started talking about MFN treatment was upon a withdrawal, what would happen if we withdrew from NAFTA, and what would happen is Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. are all subject to MFN treatment at the WTO. So what would happen is we have pre-negotiated, span, right, where you would have a lower tariff and then you would have a ceiling tariff that you could apply to countries with MFN treatment, which is nearly all of them. So for Donald Trump to say that he wants to, substantially increase tariffs of cars to 20% or more, that would be outside of that MFN treatment that the U.S. is obliged to give as a WTO member. So right now they're getting preferential treatment under NAFTA. So if he were to withdraw and raise the tariffs, he would be subjected to that MFN treatment. So that's general tariff treatment that is not subject to an FTA. Does that make sense? I want to make sure I tried that.
Yes. Excellent, excellent. Yes, and we're getting a private message that yes, that made sense. Thank you so much, Professor Cauley. For anyone interested in learning more about free trade agreements, we do offer courses in advanced customs regulation studies, customs regulation, and in international business transactions. Professor Cauley actually teaches 2 of the courses, customs regulation and advanced customs regulation studies. Professor Cauley, any final thoughts for folks who are interested in learning more about customs law or trade law and career opportunities in the field?
Absolutely. Okay, well, customs is one of the up-and-coming fields in the legal career spectrum. When I was in law school, it was relatively unknown, which is really interesting to me because the customs laws were of the first to be enacted in the country back when the country was formed. So they're very important, and especially with the Trump administration coming in, there will be a lot of changes in this industry. If you are looking for a career in the transportation and logistics industry generally will be a very, very good place to look. Not only with regard to the proposed changes that President Trump is making, but there are areas where his proposals would benefit the industry as well. So it is a very exciting time to be a customs attorney or to have any other career in the transportation and logistics industry. If you are interested in something like a warehousing facility, to be a coordinator there, trucking and transportation, airline transportation, cargo ships, clearance of goods through customs, if you're interested in working for the Customs and Border Protection Agency. I mean, really the options are endless. I mean, even if you have something like, say, an accounting background. So say that you're a CPA that's licensed here in the U.S. Well, if you had specialized training in the transportation and logistics industry, then you would have knowledge about certain types of trust accounts that a customs broker would use that would give you the competitive edge over your competitors who also have a CPA license in the customs industry. Most careers on the professional level in the transportation and logistics industry require very specific knowledge. So in order to get that, of course, it would be a good idea to get some particular training with regard to the T&L industry, but also to immerse yourself, maybe perhaps an internship as well. But really, I mean, the careers are endless in this industry. I've really enjoyed practicing as a customs attorney, but there are customs brokers out there as well. The classes that I teach at Coastal are really geared toward giving that practical side as opposed to just reading case law and not really knowing the context of what's happening. My classes are really geared toward knowing what actually happened in the first place and how to practically implement the regulations on the ground level. It's important to get that kind of background so that when you get more into an advanced class like we're having this summer, that you're able to use that ground knowledge to get you into where you can think critically about a legal question that's going on. But yeah, the careers are endless. No matter what industry you are in, marketing, management, international management, trucking, being an attorney, working for customs, warehousing, teaching, it really is endless, and there are ways to customize your career specifically toward this industry. It's a really exciting time.